Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you an inspiring tale of hope, resilience, and the power of new beginnings. In a quiet corner of Nebraska, a farmer named Jack finds his world transformed when he discovers an unconscious young woman on his property. What begins as a simple act of kindness soon becomes a life-changing journey for both Jack and Emily, a woman seeking refuge and a fresh start. Their bond, forged in hardship, will not only change their lives but also breathe new life into their entire community. Don't forget to subscribe to start today's story with Life Stories. Jack Henderson had spent nearly 70 years of his life on the same piece of land in rural Nebraska, a place where the world seemed to slow down and the morning sun rose with a sense of quiet certainty. His farm was modest, no grand estates or towering barns, but it was a reflection of his work ethic, of a lifetime spent in toil. Each tool, each fence post, each row of crops telling the story of his dedication. It was simple, but it was his. Each day began in much the same way. Jack would wake before the sun, his stiff joints reminding him of the years that had passed, and make his way to the kitchen. He'd brew himself a cup of coffee and then step out onto his creaky wooden porch, the cool Nebraska air brushing against his face as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. From his porch, he would gaze out across the land, fields of wheat rippling gently in the wind, the occasional cow grazing lazily by the fence, and the distant silhouette of his barn, standing like a sentinel over the property he'd worked all his life to maintain. There was a comforting predictability to it, a rhythm that Jack had come to rely on. But on one particular morning, a stillness hung in the air that Jack couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the usual quiet peace that he cherished, it felt different, unsettling, as if something was about to change. Perhaps it was the light breeze that carried the scent of hay, or the way the birds seemed to chirp a little too loudly. Jack couldn't explain it, but a strange urge came over him to take a walk around the property that morning. He grabbed his hat, slung his cane over his arm, his knee had been giving him trouble for years, and set off toward the farthest reaches of his land. As Jack walked through the fields, the hum of nature surrounded him, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, the soft cooing of birds perched in the trees. The scent of earth and hay was familiar, comforting even. But today it carried a weight of anticipation that he couldn't shake. Jack felt his body protesting with every step, his old boots were starting to wear thin, and his legs were stiff from years of labor, but he pressed on, eager to get to the farthest edge of his property. There was something in the air today that made the walk feel necessary. When he reached the far corner of his land, near an old hay barn that had been abandoned for years, Jack stopped. It wasn't the barn that had caught his attention, it was something, or rather, someone else. There, hidden in the shadows of the barn, just inside the door, was a figure lying motionless on a stack of hay. At first, Jack thought it might be a prank, a local teenager playing some sort of joke. Or perhaps it was a drifter who had sought shelter in the barn. But as he moved closer, he saw the figure more clearly. It was a young woman, frail and unkempt, her skin smeared with dirt and her clothes torn and ill-fitting. She looked as though she hadn't eaten in days, perhaps weeks, and her breathing was shallow, her face pale beneath the grime. Jack's heart sank as he approached her, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to be out here, let alone in such a condition. "Miss," Jack called, his voice shaky with uncertainty. His words echoed in the barn, but the woman didn't stir. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched beside her, his boots crunching against the straw. Jack reached out, his fingers trembling as they found her pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Relief washed over him. But it was fleeting, her condition was dire. What had happened to her? Who was she? Jack had no answers, only the overwhelming feeling that she needed help. And fast. Jack glanced around the barn for any clues, anything that could tell him who this woman was or how she had ended up on his land. There was nothing. Just the dusty remnants of old hay bales and the worn wooden walls of the barn. which had long since fallen into disrepair. His mind raced. But he had no time to waste. He had to get her help. And quickly. With a grunt of effort, Jack lifted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost alarmingly so, and his old joints groaned under the strain. But he didn't let go. He tightened his grip and began the slow trek back toward the farmhouse. Each step a struggle against the uneven ground. He tried to ignore the questions swirling in his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her? Why was she on his farm? Abandoned and broken? But those questions had to wait. What mattered now was getting her to safety. As Jack made his way back through the heart of his farm, past fields of golden wheat and grazing cattle, he noticed the animals watching him. They always did. Their soft lowing was the only sound besides the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel path. Jack's breathing grew heavier as he walked, the weight of the woman in his arms pressing down on him. His arms ached. His back throbbed. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she needed him. By the time Jack reached the farmhouse, sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Despite the coolness of the morning air, his body was protesting. His muscles sore. But he carefully laid the woman on an old wicker couch on the porch, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. He paused for a moment to catch his breath before stepping inside to make the call. He needed help. He couldn't do this on his own. He called the nearest clinic, explaining the situation as clearly as he could. The woman needs medical attention, Jack insisted when the receptionist hesitated. She's in bad shape. Please send someone out here. It took some convincing. But eventually, the clinic agreed to send an ambulance. Jack returned to the porch, sitting beside the unconscious woman as they waited for help. There was a strange feeling of protectiveness that washed over him, and he couldn't quite place it. He wasn't a man given to sentimentality, but this woman, whoever she was, had become his responsibility, at least until the professionals arrived. As Jack sat there, his mind wandered. What had led her to this point? How had she ended up so broken? What kind of life had she lived before she stumbled onto his land? But there was no time to think about that now. All he could do was wait, and hope that the ambulance would arrive in time to save her. As the minutes stretched on, Jack sat on the porch, a sense of quiet resolve settling over him. The morning sun was rising higher in the sky, casting a soft golden glow across the farm. But there was a tight knot of anxiety in his chest that wouldn't loosen. He glanced down at the woman on the wicker couch, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. What had brought her to this state? He wondered if she had anyone in the world who cared for her. Or had she been abandoned? That thought weighed heavily on him. In all his years of farming, Jack had never seen a soul in such a condition. By the time the ambulance finally arrived, Jack had watched the world around him come alive with the steady pulse of morning. The birds sang their songs. The wind whispered through the trees. And his mind was lost in a sea of unspoken questions. The two paramedics who stepped out of the ambulance were brisk, professional. But there was something in their eyes that reflected the urgency of the situation. They approached the porch where Jack stood, nervously wringing his hands. "Will she be all right?" Jack asked. His voice edged with worry. His throat tightened. And for a moment, he felt helpless in the face of the situation. The paramedic, a woman with short blonde hair, gave him a quick glance, then turned to assess the young woman lying on the couch. "She's malnourished. Severely dehydrated. But she's alive," she said, a slight edge of optimism in her voice. "We'll do everything we can." Jack nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease in the pit of his stomach. The paramedics worked efficiently, securing the woman onto a stretcher and loading her into the ambulance. He stood back, hands trembling slightly, watching the vehicle drive away down the long, dusty road. The sun had climbed high into the sky now, and Jack felt the heat settle into his bones. But there was a quiet sense of relief. At least she wasn't alone anymore. She was in capable hands. But even as the ambulance faded from view, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. This woman, whoever she was, had come into his life for a reason. It was hard to put into words, but he felt something more than simple empathy. He felt a deep-rooted need to protect her, to make sure she found her way through whatever darkness had brought her here. Jack lingered on the porch, staring down the long road to the clinic. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. Maybe it was the years of solitude that had turned his heart toward people more than he realized. Or maybe it was something deeper, something beyond reason, that led him to act without thinking. He wasn't a man to overthink things. His actions were usually as straightforward as his life. But as he thought about the woman lying in the ambulance, he couldn't shake the sense of responsibility that had settled within him. He decided then, without thinking twice, that he wasn't going to just wait idly by. He would follow the ambulance. The clinic was only a few miles down the road, but the terrain was rough. The distance far for a man of his age with his aching joints. Yet Jack's resolve didn't waver. There was something in the air today, something calling him to go further. He grabbed his cane, took a long breath, and set off in the direction of the clinic, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The journey felt more like an eternity than the short walk it was. The road seemed longer, more winding, and Jack's body protested every step. His back ached, his knees groaned, and yet his determination didn't falter. As the sun grew hotter, his shirt grew damp with sweat. But Jack pushed forward, each step harder than the last. There was a deep, aching weariness in his muscles, but the thought of the woman kept him moving. He couldn't leave her behind. Not like this. The walk to town wasn't the kind of walk Jack was used to. It wasn't a quiet stroll across his fields or a routine check of the crops. This was different. This was a walk that demanded something more from him. It was a walk of purpose, though he hadn't fully grasped what that purpose was yet. Jack passed a few farmsteads along the way, the familiar faces of his neighbors stopping to watch him. Most of them didn't offer more than a passing glance, curiosity, perhaps, but nothing more. A few nodded, but none asked about the woman he was carrying. It wasn't that the people were rude, it was just the way things were in this quiet corner of Nebraska. People minded their own business. They helped when it was needed, but they didn't ask questions unless it was necessary. Jack had long ago accepted this about his neighbors. But today, it felt different. One man, Clyde, a burly farmer who lived a few miles down the road, leaned against his truck and called out with a smile, "Hey, Jack. What's going on here?" Jack didn't stop. He didn't even slow down as he called back. "Found her on my property." His voice was curt, leaving no room for further questions. Clyde raised an eyebrow, but Jack wasn't interested in an explanation. He didn't want anyone's pity or their assumptions. He had his reasons for helping her, and that was enough. His neighbors would understand. Or at least, they would once they knew more about the situation. But today, he wasn't focused on them. Today, his only focus was on getting this woman to safety. The road grew steeper as Jack neared the outskirts of town. His breath became labored, his lungs aching as he pressed on. He paused for a moment, leaning on his cane, trying to catch his breath. The heat of the day seemed to settle deeper into his bones, making every step harder to take. And yet, he couldn't stop. There was something pulling him forward. A force he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. It was as if he had to finish what he started. As Jack neared the town, a car slowed down behind him, its tires crunching over the gravel. The driver, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, rolled down her window and called out, "Need a hand there, Jack?" Jack hesitated. His pride was tangled with his exhaustion. But the woman in his arms had grown heavier with every step. "If you're headed toward the clinic," he called back, "I could use a lift." She glanced at the figure in his arms, her expression neutral. "Clinic's not on my way," she said, her voice polite but distant. "But good luck to you with that." And without another word, She rolled up her window and drove off, leaving Jack standing alone in a cloud of dust. Jack muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Figures. He was used to this kind of indifference. This self-reliance that permeated the town. People didn't get involved unless they had to. Jack knew that. But it didn't make it any easier. The woman needed help. And if no one else was going to step in, then he would. The rest of the walk was a blur. The clinic was in sight now, its white facade shining like a beacon against the horizon. Jack's legs were shaky. His arms were sore. And his mind was running in circles. But he pushed on. When he finally reached the clinic's front steps, he collapsed onto a wooden bench. Barely able to keep his eyes open, he leaned against the wall for support, feeling the weight of the journey take its toll. The clinic doors opened, and a receptionist came out, motioning for a nurse. Jack felt a strange sense of relief flood through him as the staff took over, moving quickly to bring the woman inside. "Is she going to be all right?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We'll do everything we can," one of the nurses replied. "She's in good hands now." Jack nodded, his chest heavy with the lingering sense of responsibility. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, his role in her life was just beginning. The hours that followed were quiet, and Jack couldn't quite bring himself to leave the clinic. The sterile white walls felt foreign to him, a far cry from the rough-hewn wood and open fields of his farm. He paced the waiting room, his boots scuffing against the tile floor with every step, his hands tightly clasped together as though holding on to something tangible, something that might keep him grounded. His thoughts were tangled, the events of the day replaying in his mind over and over again. It wasn't so much the woman herself, though Jack couldn't quite shake the sense of protectiveness that had crept into his heart. No, it was the questions. The mystery of it all, the uncertainty of who she was. Why she was there. And what had led her to this point. Her fragile body. Her weary eyes, she seemed to carry a weight of sorrow far heavier than any burden he'd ever known. And yet, beneath all that, there was something about her that seemed unbroken. A quiet strength that made Jack want to see her through, to help her rebuild, to make sure she didn't slip through the cracks like so many others. But there was little Jack could do at this moment except wait. And so he did. He waited in the sterile quiet of the clinic, watching the clock tick slowly, each minute stretching on like an eternity. He felt out of place here. His old boots worn from years of hard work. His weathered face a stark contrast to the pristine, clinical surroundings. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional shuffle of nurses and doctors moving through the hallways only deepened his sense of disconnect. This wasn't his world. His world was out there, under the open sky, amidst the scent of hay and the hum of nature. But right now, it was here, in this small waiting room, where his thoughts remained. Finally, after what felt like an age, the door to the waiting room opened, and a nurse stepped inside. She was young, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, her expression as professional and unreadable as the rest of the clinic staff. Jack stood up abruptly, his heart quickening at the sight of her. His chest tightened, and he could feel the weight of his concerns bearing down on him once again. "How is she?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. The nurse paused for a moment, scanning the clipboard in her hands before glancing up at Jack. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, before she replied. "She's stable for now. We've started some fluids, and we're running tests to get a better sense of her condition. She hasn't regained full consciousness yet, but she's responding well to treatment." She murmured a few words, though nothing coherent. Jack's breath caught in his throat at the mention of her murmuring. He didn't know why, but hearing that small detail filled him with an odd sense of relief. Even in her weakened state, she was still trying to connect with the world around her. That was a good sign. At least, he hoped it was. Thank God. Jack muttered under his breath, his heart a little lighter now, but the unease lingered. "Do you know who she is?" The nurse shook her head. her expression cautious. "We're still trying to piece that together. She hasn't been able to tell us anything about herself yet." "Do you know her?" Jack's heart skipped a beat at the question. He wasn't sure why, but something in the way she phrased it felt like a challenge. A quiet judgment. "No," he replied firmly, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions within him. "I found her on my property. She was unconscious. And she needed help. That's all I know." The nurse studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "It's just, well, it's unusual. Isn't it? A man like you bringing in a woman like her. In her condition." She paused, her gaze flicking to the door as if seeking some kind of reassurance from the rest of the staff. Jack felt his temper flare slightly at the implication behind her words. He could see it in her eyes, the unspoken question about what kind of man would go out of his way for someone like her. He had lived in this town long enough to know the assumptions people made. But it still stung. He had done what he thought was right. He hadn't asked for anyone's approval. And he didn't need anyone to tell him that what he did was out of the ordinary. "I told you," Jack said, his voice growing colder. "I found her on my land. And she needed help. No more. No less. Now, if you'll excuse me." The nurse flinched, her face softening as she quickly nodded and stepped back. "Of course. I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson. We'll take good care of her." Jack didn't respond. He turned his gaze toward the window. His jaw clenched, frustration bubbling up inside him. The town had never been kind to outsiders, especially not someone like Emily. He could feel the weight of suspicion on his back. The silent judgments from people who didn't know him, didn't understand him. The whole situation felt like too much to bear. But he couldn't back down now. Not when the woman had trusted him, had needed him. As the hours passed, Jack found himself pacing again, the anxiety creeping back into his chest. He tried to distract himself, but it was hard. His thoughts kept returning to Emily, her pale face, the quiet fragility of her body, the fact that she was so young, that she had been through something unimaginable, stirred something deep inside him. Jack was no stranger to hardship, to loss, but he knew nothing of her pain. And yet, it didn't matter. In some strange way, she had become a part of him, and he couldn't simply walk away from that. The door to the hallway opened again, and this time, it was the doctor who entered. He was tall, with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who had seen far too many broken people in his career. Jack stood, his heart pounding once again. This time, there was no nurse to soften the blow. The doctor's words would be final. "She's improving," the doctor said, offering a faint smile. "We've stabilized her. She's still very weak, but she's awake now. We've been able to give her some fluids, and she's responding well to treatment. She hasn't regained full consciousness yet, but she's murmured a few words. That's a good sign." Jack felt a rush of relief at the news, but there was still so much uncertainty. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the request. Finally, he nodded. "She's still weak, but I think it might do her some good to know someone's here." Jack followed the doctor down the sterile hallways, his heart heavy with emotion. When they reached Emily's room, Jack felt his chest tighten. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. She was lying on the bed, an 4-line taped to her arm, her breathing steady but shallow. Her dark hair framed her face, now clean of the grime that had hidden her features earlier. For a moment, Jack simply stood there, watching her. She was so fragile, so young, and yet there was something about her that reminded him of the strength of the land itself. She had endured, and that resilience, it stirred something inside him. He moved closer to her bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hang in there, miss," he murmured. "You're safe now. Just hang in there." For a moment, Jack thought he saw her eyelids flutter. It was barely noticeable, but it gave him hope. He lingered for a while longer, silently watching over her, before the doctor returned to gently usher him out of the room. As Jack stepped back into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger than either of them could understand. When Jack left the clinic that evening, he knew one thing for sure: whatever had happened to this woman, whatever her story was, he was now a part of it. And for better or worse, he was going to see it through. The next few days blurred together for Jack. After the brief visit to the clinic, he found himself returning to his farmhouse, unable to shake the image of Emily's fragile form, her body so frail against the sterile white sheets. There was a weight to it all, the sense that he was part of something bigger than himself, something that demanded his attention. He tried to resume his daily routine, tending to the farm and seeing to the animals. But the thought of Emily lingered in the back of his mind, nagging at him, pulling him back to the quiet hallways of the clinic. Jack didn't consider himself a man prone to overthinking. His life had always been straightforward, governed by the ebb and flow of the seasons, by the rhythm of the earth itself. But this sense of responsibility, of urgency, was something new. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like the pull of something greater than fate. It wasn't simply about helping a woman in need. It was as though the universe itself had thrown him into the path of this broken soul, and he had no choice but to follow through. So, after completing his chores, Jack returned to the clinic. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply done what he thought was right. But each day he found himself compelled to check on Emily. Perhaps it was the connection they had formed, brief and fragile though it was. But there was something in her eyes that made him feel as though she wasn't just some stranger in his life. She was part of something larger, a story that needed him to be a part of it, whether he was ready or not. Each day as he made his way to the clinic, the same emotions swirled in his chest. There was concern, certainly, but also a strange sense of hope. Perhaps it was foolish, but Jack had a quiet optimism about the woman. The same way the seasons changed and the land healed itself after a harsh winter, he hoped that Emily would find her way again, even if it took time. The fact that she was alive, that she had shown even the smallest signs of recovery, was a victory in itself. On the fourth day after she had been admitted, Jack was once again on his way to the clinic. He had been spending more time at the farmhouse, cleaning the barn and tending to the animals. His body ached, but it felt good to work, to lose himself in the repetitive motions that had been his solace for so many years. But even amidst the comfort of his farm, Emily's absence on the porch where he had left her those days ago gnawed at him. When Jack arrived at the clinic that afternoon, he found himself drawn immediately to Emily's room. He had hoped for an update, but when he walked into the waiting room, he was greeted with a familiar, unsettling silence. The receptionist glanced up from her desk, her eyes soft but guarded. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "She's awake." The news hit Jack like a sudden gust of wind, sweeping the breath from his chest. For a moment, he just stood there, stunned, as if he hadn't expected this moment to come. But then, all at once, his feet were moving, carrying him toward Emily's room with a purpose he couldn't deny. As he stepped into her room, Jack was struck by how much she had changed in such a short amount of time. Her face, once pale and drawn, was now tinged with a faint glow. There was color in her cheeks, though her eyes remained tired, the heavy weight of her ordeal still visible in the dark circles under her eyes. She looked fragile, yes, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the broken woman he had found in his barn, but someone different, someone who was beginning to rebuild. Emily looked up at him as he entered, her expression cautious, guarded. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes flickered over him, studying him with a quiet curiosity. It wasn't until Jack took a step closer that she spoke, her voice faint but steady. "Morning," she said softly, a tentative smile curling at the corners of her lips. Jack couldn't help but smile in return, though it was small and reluctant. "Morning," he replied gruffly, his voice still thick from the emotions he hadn't yet sorted out. "You're looking better." She nodded slightly, her gaze shifting away as if she was still processing the reality of her situation. There was a pause between them, a silence that felt both uncomfortable and reassuring at the same time. Jack didn't push her to speak. He understood, in a way, that sometimes the words weren't necessary. There was something between them, unspoken yet powerful, a connection born not from conversation but from shared understanding. For a while, neither of them spoke. Emily took a slow, steady breath, her eyes flickering to the window where the light was dimming, and then back to Jack. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For finding me." Jack shifted on his feet, uncomfortable with the gratitude. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate it, it was just that, for him, helping her had felt like the only thing he could do. There had been no thought to it, no second guessing. He had acted because it was right, because someone needed to. He shrugged, his voice low. "Didn't do much. Just helped when I could." Emily's eyes softened as she studied him, though there was still a distance between them, a barrier that neither seemed ready to cross. "Still," she said, "not everyone would have done it. Not everyone would have brought me here." Jack paused, unsure of how to respond. His chest tightened at her words, and for a brief moment, he felt something deep stir within him, something he hadn't expected. A quiet respect for the woman before him, for her resilience, for the strength she had to pull herself back from the edge. "I'm just glad you're here," Jack said softly. "Glad you made it." Emily nodded again, her lips pressing together as if she were fighting to hold back the emotions that threatened to rise to the surface. It was clear that her past was one of hardship, she hadn't spoken of it yet. But Jack could see it in the way she carried herself, in the carefulness of her words. It wasn't his place to ask. Not yet. After a while, Jack sat down beside her bed, leaning against the cool wall. The quiet between them settled, comfortable now, as they both found their place in this strange new reality. Emily, still uncertain, seemed to draw strength from the calmness of the moment, from the simplicity of Jack's presence. Neither of them knew what would come next, but for the first time, the weight of the journey ahead seemed a little less daunting. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Jack finally rose to leave, his steps slow and deliberate. Before he reached the door, Emily's voice called out to him. "I'm still not sure what comes next," she said quietly, "but I'm glad you're here." Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips as he turned back to look at her. "Me too," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "Me too." The days that followed marked a quiet transition for Jack and Emily. Each visit Jack made to the clinic seemed to shift the dynamic between them, slowly weaving together the fragile threads of a bond neither of them had fully understood at the outset. When Jack first found Emily on his farm, she had been nothing more than a stranger, someone in desperate need of help. Now, with each passing day, she seemed to become more than just the person he had rescued. She was someone he felt responsible for. Someone who had unwittingly crept into the quiet spaces of his life. For Emily, the road to recovery was far from linear. Though the physical signs of malnutrition and exhaustion began to fade, her spirit remained guarded. She spoke little about her past, and when she did, her words were often fragmented, hesitant. But Jack, in his quiet wisdom, didn't press her for answers. He knew that healing took time, and sometimes the wounds of the heart ran deeper than the ones that could be bandaged with medical care. Jack had always been a man of few words, his life defined by simple routines and steady work. But with Emily, he found himself becoming more reflective, more attuned to the subtle shifts in her mood. He started to notice the small things, the way her eyes darted to the window when she heard the distant sound of children playing outside, the way she seemed to withdraw at times, lost in her own thoughts, as if the weight of her memories was too much to bear. But there were moments of lightness too, moments when Emily would smile at him in a way that made Jack feel For the first time in a long time. Like he wasn't entirely alone in this world. There was something comforting about their quiet companionship. Something unspoken that held them together. It was as if, through all the pain and uncertainty, they were both finding a new rhythm, a new way of being. On one of his visits to the clinic, Jack walked into Emily's room to find her sitting up in bed. A book in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening with the smallest hint of recognition. There was no trace of the fragility she had once carried. Now, she seemed stronger, more present in the world around her. "Good morning, Jack," she said softly, her voice steady and clear, though still faint. Jack returned the smile, though his own was more reserved. "Morning," he replied, stepping closer to her bed. "How's it going today?" "Better," Emily answered, her gaze drifting to the book in her hands. "I've been reading a bit. Keeps my mind off things." Jack nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He hadn't picked up a book in years, preferring the simplicity of the farm, the physical work that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. But he could see how much it meant to Emily, how it gave her a sense of normalcy, a connection to a life that was beginning to feel distant. "You're doing well," Jack said, though his voice carried a hint of something deeper. Something like pride. "Really well." Emily looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a softness that Jack hadn't seen before. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said quietly, her voice wavering just slightly. "You didn't have to help me, but you did." Jack shifted on his feet, uncomfortable with the gratitude. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate it, it was just that, for him, helping her had never been a choice. It had simply been the right thing to do. And Jack didn't need any recognition for it. He just wanted to see her recover, to see her get better. "Just did what I thought was right," he said, shrugging slightly, his gruff voice betraying none of the emotions that stirred in him. Emily smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. "I know. But that doesn't make it any less meaningful." There was a long pause as the two of them sat in the quiet room, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jack didn't know how to respond, so he simply sat down in the chair beside her bed, resting his hands on his knees. He wasn't one for long speeches or declarations, but in that moment, he realized just how much his quiet acts of kindness had meant, not just to Emily, but to him as well. Over the next few days, Jack continued to visit Emily, but with each passing day, he found himself spending less time in the sterile confines of the clinic and more time at the farmhouse. Emily's condition was improving, and there was a quiet understanding between them that it was time for her to leave the hospital. She needed space to heal fully, to find her place again. The decision felt natural, though it was still daunting for both of them. One afternoon, after a long day of work on the farm, Jack made the decision to invite Emily to the house. He knew she needed rest, and the clinic had done what it could for her. But there was something more she needed, something the sterile walls of a hospital couldn't provide. The evening was cool, the sun beginning to dip low on the horizon. Jack had been preparing for this moment, and as he cleaned up the farmhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was on the verge of unfolding. When Emily arrived, it was a quiet affair, no fanfare, no grand speeches. Jack simply helped her into the house and settled her into a comfortable chair by the fire. As she sat there, looking out the window at the vast expanse of fields stretching before them, Jack could see the shift in her. She seemed to be at peace, at least. More at peace than she had been in days. The two of them sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Emily was still recovering, but there was something about being in the quiet space of Jack's farm that made it all feel less heavy, less overwhelming. The simple act of being together, of sharing this small corner of the world, seemed to help them both heal in ways they hadn't expected. As the evening wore on, Emily turned to Jack with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she began softly, her voice tentative but steady. "Maybe I could help you around the farm. I know I'm still recovering, But I want to contribute. To pull my weight. Jack raised an eyebrow, the corner of his lips twitching. You sure about that? This farm isn't exactly easy work. Emily's eyes sparkled with determination. And she nodded firmly. I'm tougher than I look. Jack chuckled. The sound deep and genuine. All right then. We'll see what you've got. And so, with that simple exchange, the next chapter of their lives began. There were no promises. No guarantees. But Jack felt, for the first time in a long while, that maybe this was where he was meant to be. Maybe. Just maybe. They were both in the right place at the right time. And it was only just the beginning. Elding a new life. The days began to blend together in a rhythm that was both comforting and new. The seasons were shifting. And Jack had begun to see the world with a renewed sense of purpose. The work on the farm continued. As always. With the crops needing tending and the animals to care for. But there was something different now. It wasn't just the sound of the wind in the trees or the soft lowing of cattle. It was the presence of Emily in the farm's quiet corners. Her determination growing as each day passed. Though she had been physically frail when she first arrived, Emily's resilience began to show. Each morning, she woke with purpose. Her gaze steady and focused as she carried out small tasks around the farm. Jack had initially been uncertain whether she was truly ready to handle the hard work. But as the days wore on, he saw the spark in her eyes, the same kind of grit he had grown up with. The same quiet strength that had carried him through years of hardship. It didn't take long before Emily was helping with everything from milking the cows to tending to the garden. Her hands, though still delicate, grew calloused from the work. And Jack couldn't help but admire her tenacity. She had a natural instinct for the land. A deep connection to the earth that seemed to run through her veins. She could read the rhythm of the animals and the seasons with surprising ease. As if she had been born to be here. In this space where the soil and the sky were her constant companions. For Jack, the change was subtle but undeniable. The farm, once a place of solitude, had begun to hum with a new energy. The two of them worked side by side in the fields. Sometimes talking. Sometimes just letting the silence between them fill the air. It was a comfortable silence. One that didn't need words to be understood. Jack found himself enjoying the moments of shared work. The quiet camaraderie that seemed to arise naturally between them. There were still moments. Of course. When the weight of Emily's past seemed to settle over her like a shadow. Sometimes. Jack would catch her looking out over the fields with a far-off expression. As though she was lost in thought or memories she wasn't yet ready to share. It made him wonder. Briefly. What she had left behind, what had driven her to this place. To his farm. But he didn't press her. He knew that when she was ready, she would talk. And until then, all he could do was be there for her. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of work in the fields, Jack found Emily sitting on the porch. Her hands resting lightly in her lap. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in rich shades of orange and pink. It was a peaceful evening. The kind that made Jack feel grounded. As if the land itself was offering him a moment of respite. Emily looked up as Jack approached. Her face soft with a gentle smile. "You're early today," she remarked. Her voice light. "I figured I'd finish up the chores early. Could use a bit of rest." Jack replied, settling into the chair beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Letting the warmth of the evening settle around them. The soft cluck of the chickens in the coop. The distant bleating of the sheep. And the rustling of leaves in the trees were the only sounds that filled the air. Emily seemed at ease. And Jack found himself relaxing in her presence. The tension of the day slowly melting away. After a while, Emily broke the silence. "Jack," she began. Her tone thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. I mean, I don't want to just stay here and do the same thing every day. I want to help. To do something that means something." Jack turned to her. His brow furrowing slightly. He had always been someone who focused on the task at hand. and he had never really considered what the future might hold beyond the farm. But there was something in Emily's eyes, something that told him she was searching for more. Something beyond the quiet days of working the land. "What do you have in mind?" Jack asked, his voice neutral but curious. Emily hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her sleeve. "I don't know exactly," she said slowly, "but I was thinking about starting something. Maybe a program. Something that helps people who've been through tough times. People like me, who've been lost and don't know where to turn." Jack's eyes softened as he listened to her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of something in his chest, pride, perhaps, or hope. Emily had always been strong, but now she was looking beyond herself. She wanted to give back, to offer others the kind of second chance she had been given. "I think that's a good idea," Jack said quietly. "You've got the spirit for it, and I've no doubt that you can make it work." Emily smiled at him, the warmth in her expression reaching all the way to her eyes. "Thanks, Jack. I think I want to start here, in this town. Maybe a place for people to come together, to find a way out of whatever darkness they're stuck in. Like how you helped me when I had nowhere to go." Jack nodded, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. It was a simple idea, but it held so much promise. The farm, which had always been his sanctuary, could become something more. A place for healing, for community, a place where people could come together, share their burdens, and find hope. The idea began to take root in Emily's mind, and she threw herself into it with the same determination she had shown on the farm. She began organizing small gatherings at the community center, reaching out to others who had struggled like she had. With Jack's support, she began to build a network of people who were eager to share their stories, to support one another in ways that had never been possible before. As the weeks passed, Emily's vision began to take shape. The farm became a hub of activity, not just for Jack and Emily, but for the people of the town. There was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other now shared meals and stories, offering support and encouragement to those who needed it most. Jack watched all of this unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had never imagined that his farm could be the foundation for something so much larger than himself. And as Emily worked tirelessly to bring her vision to life, Jack found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. He had always been content with the simple life he had built for himself. But now, he realized, there was more. The farm wasn't just a place to work, it was a place to heal, to grow, and to make a difference. And with Emily by his side, he knew that the future held something better than either of them had ever imagined. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he wasn't just going through the motions of life. He was a part of something bigger, a community, a story, a journey. And that, he realized, was a gift he could never have predicted. As the months passed, Jack's life slowly began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. The farm, which had once been a place of solitude and hard labor, had transformed into a place of gathering, a place of growth and connection. Emily's presence had been the catalyst for that change, and Jack couldn't help but marvel at how her strength and determination had brought the town together. The work on the farm was still demanding, and Jack found himself putting in long hours to keep the crops growing and the animals cared for. But it was different now. The farm felt like it had purpose beyond just feeding Jack and sustaining his simple life. It was a hub, a place where people came not just for the harvest, but for something more, a sense of belonging, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. And Jack, though he was a man of few words, couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in what Emily had started. It started with small gatherings, people from the town who had once kept to themselves, now coming together in the evenings, sharing food and stories. Jack wasn't always a part of those gatherings. He preferred the solitude of the barn or the quiet of the fields. But he watched from a distance, with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The farm was no longer just his, it was theirs. It was a place where people could come to heal, to find solace, and to offer support to one another. The evenings were always the most alive. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifting in the cool night air. Emily had worked tirelessly to foster a sense of community, and it was beginning to take root in ways that felt both profound and natural. She had an uncanny ability to make people feel seen, to make them believe that they, too, had something valuable to offer. She spoke to people with kindness, with understanding, and slowly, they began to open up. Jack found himself walking the farm more frequently in the evenings, drawn to the sound of people gathering near the barn. He would stand at the edge of the field, watching as Emily spoke with neighbors and newcomers alike. He saw the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of the future, the way people looked at her with newfound respect. And Jack felt something stir inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd been missing. As Emily's program grew, Jack became more involved. Though in his own quiet way, he helped with the physical aspects, repairing fences, setting up spaces for gatherings, and occasionally offering a hand with the animals when things became too hectic. He wasn't one for speeches or grand gestures, but his presence had become a cornerstone of the work Emily was doing. The two of them worked in tandem, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as Jack worked on fixing a fence near the farthest corner of the property, Emily approached him, her face flushed from the sun, her hands dusty from the work. There was a quiet determination in her expression as she came closer. "I've been thinking," Emily began, her voice steady but laced with excitement. "I want to expand the program. There's so much more we can do, more people who need help, more places we can reach." Jack wiped his brow, studying her carefully. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had drawn him to help her when she had first stumbled onto his farm. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. "I want to start a market, a community market where people can sell their goods, share their skills. Not just for the farm, but for the whole town. I want to create something that connects everyone, people from different backgrounds, with different stories, together in one place. We can offer people a chance to make a living, to share what they have. There's so much potential here." Jack looked out over the land, his eyes resting on the rows of crops that stretched out before him. He could see the vision in her words, see how it might transform not just the farm, but the town itself. It was a big idea, a bold one, but he had learned over the months that Emily had a way of making big things happen. She had already done it once. And maybe, just maybe, she could do it again. "I think it's a good idea," Jack said slowly, his voice rough with the weight of his thoughts. "But it's going to take a lot of work. A lot of time." Emily nodded, her face lighting up with the excitement of what lay ahead. "I know. But I think we're ready. You've seen the way things have changed already. This could be the next step." Jack didn't argue. He didn't have to. He could see the passion in her eyes, and he knew she wouldn't stop until she saw it through. For the first time in his life, Jack felt like he was part of something larger. His small farm, his quiet life had become something more. It had become the heart of a community, the place where hope was being sown in ways he had never imagined. And now, as he looked at Emily, as he saw the vision in her eyes, he knew that he was willing to do whatever it took to make that vision a reality. The idea of a community market began to take shape. Slowly but surely, Emily reached out to her network, speaking to farmers, artisans, and craftspeople from the surrounding areas, encouraging them to participate. Jack, though not one for socializing, became the quiet backbone of the operation. He helped build stalls, set up spaces for people to gather, and offered his farm's produce to get things started. As the market day approached, the excitement in the town grew. People began to come together, offering their goods and services. The sense of community that had been building for months was now palpable. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling of something new being born. When the first market day arrived, it was more than Jack had ever hoped for. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the land as people gathered in the fields. There were booths set up with fresh produce, homemade jams, and handmade goods. The laughter and conversation filled the air, and Jack, standing on the porch of the farmhouse, watched as the farm he had worked so hard for became something much more. As Emily stood at the center of the bustling market, Jack felt a swell of pride in his chest. This was her vision, her dream, and now it was alive. The farm, once a solitary place of labor, had become a beacon of hope for the entire town. It was, in every sense of the word, a new beginning. For Jack, for Emily, and for the community they had built together. And as the sun began to set, casting the market in a soft, golden light, Jack knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. The seeds of change had been planted, and now, they were beginning to grow. The first market day was a success, more than anyone had expected. The sun had set, casting a warm amber glow across the farm as families gathered in small groups, laughing and chatting, children running barefoot through the fields. The air was thick with the scents of freshly baked bread, roasted vegetables, and the sweet smell of fruit preserves. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of connection to something greater. The farm, which had been his world for so many years, had become a place of life and energy, a place where people came together not just to work, but to celebrate, to heal. He watched from the porch, leaning against the old wooden railing, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Emily stood at the center of the activity, her face bright with joy as she moved from one person to another, thanking them for their participation, encouraging them to take part in the festivities. Her eyes sparkled with the same energy that had ignited the vision for the market in the first place. She was radiant, in a way that made everything around her seem brighter. It was as if her spirit was woven into the very fabric of the farm. Jack wasn't one for crowds or gatherings, but today was different. He felt a sense of pride, not just for the farm he had worked so hard to build, but for Emily, for the way she had transformed everything she touched. Her energy had brought this town together in a way that no one could have predicted. She had become the bridge that connected so many, creating a space where people could come together, share their stories, and offer their support. As the evening wore on and the last of the visitors began to leave, Jack found himself standing by the barn, watching as Emily spoke to one of the local farmers. Her words animated as she discussed future plans for the market. There was something about her, something magnetic that made people want to follow her lead. Jack had watched as she transformed from a woman on the edge, broken and alone, to someone who was now building a future for herself and for everyone else around her. When the last of the market-goers had packed up their booths and the field was quiet again, Emily walked over to Jack, her face still glowing from the success of the day. Her steps were light, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. As she approached, Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but it was a contented exhaustion, the kind that comes after giving everything you have to something you believe in. "That was incredible," Emily said softly, her voice full of awe. "I can't believe it, people came together. They actually came together." Jack smiled, his hands resting on the porch railing as he regarded her with quiet admiration. "You did it, Emily. You brought them together." She shook her head, her hair shimmering in the soft evening light. "No, we did it. You, me, everyone who believed in it. It's not just me, Jack. It's all of us. This place, it's becoming something more than I ever imagined." Jack could hear the emotion in her voice, the pride she felt in the work they had done together. For the first time since he had met her, Jack felt a shift in his heart. He had always been a man of few words, but Emily had shown him a different side of life. She had reminded him that there was more to the world than just the work, it was the people, the connections, the stories that shaped everything. The farm had become something of a sanctuary, not just for Jack and Emily, but for everyone who came to visit. People were sharing ideas, swapping stories, and offering a helping hand to those who needed it. It was as though the simple act of coming together had planted a seed of change in the town. The market had become a symbol of hope, of new beginnings, of second chances. And Jack couldn't help but feel that, somehow, he was part of something far larger than he had ever imagined. As the evening grew darker, the soft hum of crickets filled the air, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them. Emily sat beside Jack on the porch, her legs stretched out in front of her, a peaceful look on her face as she gazed at the horizon. The quiet between them was comfortable, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. This, he thought, was where he was meant to be, not just on the farm, but with Emily. They were partners in this, whether by fate or by choice, and the journey they had embarked on together was just beginning. "I'm proud of you," Jack said softly, breaking the silence between them. Emily looked at him, surprised by his words. Her expression softened, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Jack. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Jack nodded, his eyes focused on the flickering light from the barn. "You've got something special, Emily. You always have. You just needed someone to believe in you." She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on her lap as she looked up at the night sky. The soft light of the stars seemed to reflect in her eyes. And for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together, of the bond that had been forged between them. "I never thought I would be here," Emily said quietly, her voice tinged with a kind of wonder. "When I first arrived, I didn't know what would happen. I thought I was just passing through, that I was lost. But now I can see that there's so much more. This place, this community, everything has changed because of it." Jack turned to her, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "You've changed it, Emily. You've changed all of us." The evening stretched on, the sounds of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Jack didn't have to say much more. The truth was in the air, in the way they sat together, watching the stars above, knowing that the work they had done was just the beginning. The farm, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a place of hope, a place where new beginnings were nurtured and where the past was slowly healed. As the night deepened, Jack felt a deep sense of contentment in his chest. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for certain: this was where he was meant to be. And with Emily by his side, there was nothing that could stop them from building something beautiful together. A future full of promise, full of hope, and full of the kind of second chances that could change everything. As the days passed, Jack and Emily continued to nurture the seeds of change they had planted together, transforming not only the farm but their entire community. What began as a simple act of kindness grew into something greater, a testament to the power of connection, empathy, and the strength of new beginnings. The farm became a place of refuge, a hub of hope, and a symbol of what can happen when people come together. And as Jack watched Emily's dreams unfold, he realized that sometimes the greatest gifts in life are the ones you never expect. They had both found their place, and in the process, they had changed each other's lives forever. Thank you for following this incredible journey of transformation and resilience. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another life story. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales,